intersex just means that folks have deviated from that blueprint at some point during their development.
But is it possible to go your whole life without knowing intersex, or is that less common? We'll prove that we can answer this question. What is a woman? Hello and welcome to AnthroTalk, the podcast about all things anthropology and humanity. I'm your host, Jake Selesky, and with me today I have Chloe Swanson. Chloe recently received a PhD in psychology from the University of California, Davis, where she wrote a dissertation on how close social relationships impact physiological processes like sleep and reproduction. She also taught gender and human reproduction, which is where I met her, which means she is a former professor of mine, going 5 for 5 now. Chloe, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jake. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you be here. So one of the topics we discussed in the gender and human reproduction class was intersex people, which is really interesting to me. Because growing up, at least in America, you hear all this about a binary, with sex and gender, or even that they're the same thing. Especially nowadays with the political climate. Intersex people are a very interesting topic to study, I think. Because it goes beyond just the do you have X and Y or XX, question. It goes beyond that. Do you have this part or that part? So before we get into all that, I just wanted to set a definition. What does it mean to be intersex?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you kind of alluded, there is a clarification to be made between sex and gender. They reference different identities, and we use different words to discuss them. So sex refers to biological traits like chromosomes, gonads, internal and external reproductive structures, and hormones that are produced by the body before and after birth. The categories we use to describe biological sex in the scientific community are female, male, and intersex. So you'll often see this reduced down to female or male when folks really want to lean into that two category experience. Factually, that's incorrect. And that is a big differentiation we make within the biological sciences and within the biological and developmental community. Gender, on the other hand, as you alluded to, very different, is a psychosocial construct that encompasses how an individual identifies, how they present, and how they're perceived by others. Unlike the concrete categories that we use to define sex, there are infinite ways to define and construct gender. If we think about the infinite creativity of the human mind and our ability to, create and expand our own consciousness, I think that gives you an idea of the possibilities in the realm of gender. To be very clear, people who are intersex may or may not identify as trans on top of their intersex identity. They may identify as straight, queer, any and all of these that interact with gender and sexuality. This is separate from their identity as an intersex person because this is a sex-based biological category. Just as much as, my identity as a woman doesn't necessarily map onto my assigned gender or my assigned gender of being a girl and woman or my presumed gender based on how I was assigned sex at birth.
Makes sense. So there's a lot more
So
than just sex to somehow someone presents themselves.
absolutely. And when we talk about folks who are intersex, we're strictly speaking about people who are falling into this third category. They're not strictly female or male in anatomy, in their prenatal hormonal experience, or their sex chromosome composition. Intersex represents this biological diversity that is simply natural variation in developmental trajectories. This is always been the case. In any species, there is variation in development, and you'll see that across the animal kingdom and within, all species.
I see. So then, how common is the trait of being intersex?
Well, there's different kind of classifications. Some advocates will say that chromosomal diversity does count, or it's included in under the umbrella of intersex, and others will restrict the definition to apply solely to individuals who differ from male or female typical gonadal, hormonal, and anatomical development. There's a developmental trajectory or blueprint that typically occurs for individuals who are XX or XY in terms of their sex chromosome composition. And intersex just means that folks have deviated from that blueprint at some point during their development. And again, this is a prenatal experience. This is not, a choice or, a lifestyle that people have chosen. This is a biological difference that happens during development. And as we'll get into later, whether or when that is discovered varies quite significantly as well.
I see. So it's just like someone being tall, or born short, or born blue eyes, or born brown eyes. Intersex is just part of who someone is, their biological makeup. It's not something they choose. You can't even choose to be intersex, right? I imagine.
No, and I think that's an important differentiation to make along with, you know, gender identity has a lot of choice involved in the expression, but not in the feeling, right? It's your identity is your own. And then how you choose to express that and how people interact with your expression as perception, those feed into this psychological aspect, but the sentiment of the feeling of gender, the feeling of who you are, that also, not a choice. Expression is a choice, and how we manifest our own sentiments and feelings, right? But like sex, also not a choice. It happens to us in development. We can't control it without science any more than somebody can control having a female or a male child, unless we're doing in vitro and embryonic manipulation. We don't play a role in that.
Mm.
Sex just happens.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good thing to point out too. To people, this is just a natural part of who people are. And it kind of like I feel like when you talk about intersex, it kind of just breaks this binary people have of you're either a man or a woman, and there's no other terms, no male or female. So I like to kind of define more of the terms that we've brought up for those in the audience who might not be familiar with them. So you brought up gender identity and gender expression. Could you dive a bit more into those words and what they mean?
Absolutely.
And how they
Identity
might differ
is,
from gender and sex as well.
yes. So gender as a psychosocial construct is encompassed by three main factors: identity, expression, and perception. Identity is within ourselves. It is our sense of knowing who we are, um, and how that kind of manifests within the constructs of gender presented to us by society. Do we fit into traits that align with girlhood or womanhood? Do we fit into traits that align or that we've been told align with boyhood or manhood? Do we exist outside of those two conceptions? Do we cross boundaries between those two conceptions? And I think that's where it's important to conceptualize gender as a continuum as well. I, identify as a woman. I would not say that I tick every box for the stereotypical ideas of what a woman should be. Um, you can attest, I was your instructor. We talked a lot about different topics throughout our time together in the class. And I, you know, believe strongly in science. I'm a woman in STEM. That I don't think for a lot of people meshes in their conception of, super feminine or necessarily like strict gender norms for women. And I would challenge that and say it's an outdated belief. But there are, I'm sure, many people who would contest that alone. I grew up playing sports, and maybe that doesn't align with people's conception of girlhood. But nevertheless, I know who I am, and that is my internal knowing and narrative. My gender expression is going to be how I present my gender to the world, right? I can identify as being a woman and dress, you know, any way I'd like to because I know that I am a woman. So, how do I present my womanhood, my sense of self, my gender to an outer audience? And then finally, how is that perceived by other people? So, that's the most external version of gender. So, if I'm performing my gender, as authentic or not authentic as that is to my own gender identity, how is that perceived by the public or by by other people. So that is kind of the nesting, the nesting of gender. We want to use words to talk about and describe gender that are, about gender. Female and male refer to biological sex, intersex, biological sex. So when we talk about gender, when I fill out a form and I'm asked, what gender are you? I would check a box for woman because that is how I self identify. Um, there are often not enough not enough boxes to tick for a lot of people, and I would also say that having any boxes at all is limiting for a lot of people. um, as a psychologist, if I were designing a survey and I were asking a question about gender, um, the way you write a survey question or the way you write a free response question for certain variables, this is not a quantifiable one in the same way that sex is. If I asked, what sex are you? Right? That's it. There's three options, you check a box. If I ask what gender you are, that should be a free response question, right? Like you're going to get mostly two different answers. Knowing the population of our country, of our world, you're mostly going to get two answers, but that doesn't mean there aren't other options. And you lose the nuance, you lose the interesting parts of humanity when you force people into spaces that they don't feel they belong.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. I agree with all of that. So to recap, there's I think four different gender things you discussed there. There's gender roles, which is how society perceives genders, how society perceives how genders should be. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a fair amount of stereotyping and kind of generalization. And the human brain loves to categorize, right? Like we want to put things in a box so that we can understand them. So if we make a list of traits that we associate with a given gender, and then we enforce that on people, right? You'll see gendering done really early in life, whether it's within the home and people making choices about what toys to give their children, what clothes to dress their children in, right? These are maybe infants who necessarily don't have any preferences or even the visual acuity to make these kinds of choices yet. So this is definitely the first kind of opportunity we have um, to gender a child, right? And then there's increases in that within schools. There are ways that we treat different gendered children that are distinct based on what gender we assume that they are based on biological characteristics.
Mm, yeah, it's true. We're constantly being gendered all the time. So gender roles, the gender identity, which is how you personally feel about your gender expression, which is how you express your gender identity to the public, and there was gender perception, right? Or that's how other people perceive your gender, correct?
Yes. And perception is really based on expression. I think a lot of people who are gender fluid or non binary will tell you that they are pretty judged based on how they present. But there are also ways of, I think for safety or for particular moments, wanting to be perceived in other ways. And so you might get particular expression in particular moments or specific spaces that do or don't feel safer. You may see greater diversity of expression, gender expression at a pride parade, for example, than you would necessarily in like a Wall Street office.
Yeah, I can imagine for sure, or a church or something, you know. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. I think it's really good to define these terms. And I think that I've seen a lot of people talk about, oh, there's too many terms these days and too many definitions. But I think it's just because you're breaking it down more. You know, like
Mhm.
this is a laptop in front of me right now. But there's also like a monitor and a keyboard and a trackpad and a CPU and a memory and all that kind of stuff. It's also all of that. So all these terms aren't inventing new things. There's explaining more about what already exists in our world today. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's building a vocabulary to better understand the diversity that already exists and has existed. I saw a great interview where an intersex and a trans activist were having a conversation, and they were saying, this represents diversity. We represent diversity that has always existed, as long as there have been living things in the world, there have been, you know, individuals that don't fall into a category one way or another. And, you know, as long as there have been people, there have been trans people. As long as there have been biological organisms, there have been intersex organisms and intersex people. So these are not something new. We are just learning how to talk about it. We're learning a new vocabulary. And in many ways, and many times, this vocabulary has existed. It's just now becoming much more mainstream as we hopefully work harder to be more inclusive with our language, but also learn how to communicate with groups that we've long ostracized from, I would say, more mainstream society.
Yeah, yeah. I like how you said talking about bringing back the terms because I read that Hippocrates thousands of years ago said that there are male and female and intersex people in the world. So back then, thousands of years ago, he was recognizing that. Then the church came around and said there are only two categories. Even I think there's something like there are only two categories, even if someone appears to be outside those categories. So I'm not trying to demonize the church here. I'm just saying that we have had these terms before, like you said, but they've been overwritten by new ideas. You know.
Absolutely. And you will, I think, revisit this idea of forced conformity later in our conversation, especially in light of kind of current pushes in one direction.
Yeah, I disagree with this strongly. To be clear, I'm not going to keep my beliefs hidden here. But
No, that's fair. And I think we think you know, it's difficult to teach a class that is, you know, mostly science and then interacts with public policy, especially policy that is being made um, during the course of of the academic term without touching on some of these aspects. And my hope for the class is that um, it was mostly science and inviting students to interrogate their own beliefs and the news and current events with the science we were learning. Um, but I have no doubt that as a fallible human, some of my own bias probably did come through on that one.
maybe, but I agree with those biases. So I really enjoyed the class personally. Um, but getting back to intersex people, now that we have those definitions of sex and gender identity, expression, I was curious about how intersex people are identified. Can it always be discovered at birth when someone's born, or when looking at someone, or is it possible to be intersex without even knowing about it?
um, all all of those options are possible. Some intersex conditions are discovered at birth or even in utero. So if we include chromosomal diversity in the intersex umbrella, those are that is often identifiable during really early chromosomal testing. So most pregnant people will undergo some kind of chromosomal testing during their pregnancy just to check on the health of the pregnancy, the fetus, and kind of understand what's going on as this pregnancy progresses. Typically, this is conducted with a routine chromosomal test in the first trimester. And at this point, you would discover if the fetus was XY, XX, or other. There are lots of different combinations that result in viable pregnancies and viable births that are not XX and XY. The only, you know, real combination that you'll see is lethal every time is if there is no X chromosome. So if it's a Y chromosome alone, we're not even gonna have a pregnancy. That is something that's embryonic lethal. It's not going to progress to a stage where that embryo develops.
Mm, I see.
So that would be pre-birth. If there's something hormonal going on, it's very difficult to detect. You'd have to do a hormonal test really at a very specific time. That's difficult to do for a number of reasons, including tracking gestational age that early. Um, so most likely anything hormonal or the result of like enzymatic differences, so enzymes that can or can't be synthesized by the body, that is all going to manifest later, and that's something that you would find once that fetus is fully mature and goes through birth. Um, in many cases, it's going to be, if it's not diagnosed at birth, there will be maybe some changes that we don't expect that occur, or some changes that we do expect that don't occur at puberty. That's another kind of diagnostic point that we would expect to see folks understanding they have an intersex condition and experience.
I see. So in general, it sounds like there many ways to see if someone's intersex or not. But is it possible to go your whole life without knowing intersex, or is that less common?
Um, Depending on where you live and your access to healthcare, and kind of the intersex literacy of your healthcare team, it is more or less likely. So I would say folks with congenital adrenal hyperplasia or CAH, it can vary in severity, but essentially your adrenal glands produce cortisol, which regulates several very important functions of the body, uh, without which you cannot live. So if a child is born and they're not making any cortisol, sorry, it's pretty apparent very early that this is needs medical intervention. Prompts, a test to look at what's going on, and then the condition is identified. CAH may also be visually identified at birth because it results in some ambiguous genitalia. So if it's severe enough to cause identifiable issues phenotypically, then it would be diagnosed that way as well. Usually it's a combination therein, but those children typically need to be on medication pretty much from the time they're born to replace the cortisol that their body cannot make. So that's an example of one that's like really identifiable at birth because that child needs medical attention, and typically needs supplemental cortisol in order to live. But they can live perfectly healthy, happy lives, just with a supplement.
I see. That's good. So it sounds like you're saying that intersex people and probably their parents most likely know they're intersex, but not always the person, like not always like a stranger seeing that person will know they are intersex.
Yes, in many cases, it's not a particular phenotype, like someone walking down the street would be able to identify. There are, like I said, conditions that are identifiable at birth because they cause health issues or they're phenotypical abnormalities or atypical factors, I would say, that kind of distinguish them from not quite the typical female or male phenotype of external genitalia. Anything that's internal is likely to be missed right away unless it corresponds with another health issue. Um, but once children hit puberty, if typical pubertal changes are not occurring or atypical pubertal changes are occurring, that tends to be another diagnostic point where medical professionals may be asked to weigh in on, why hasn't a young girl developed her period yet? Why hasn't a child gone through what we consider kind of the androgen changes, or like, the underarm hair, um, kind of those kind of physiological changes associated with puberty? Why has someone who is presumed to be female at birth, why are they going through what we consider typical male changes in puberty? These are all questions that may prompt an eventual diagnosis as well.
I see. I see. So for the people who are intersex and it's noticeable at birth through genital changes, there are a lot of times surgeries that are done, as I'm aware, that make someone look more of a certain sex. And also, I believe there are also medical surgeries done to ensure medical functioning of a person. What are your thoughts generally on intersex surgeries at birth? Should these be outlawed and considered genital mutilation? Should be left up to the parents? Is the kind of middle ground? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as with most of what we're discussing, there's nuance and important differences to be had throughout this discussion. In some cases, surgical intervention is necessary for the health, survival, or comfort of the child. So with CAH, which we discussed earlier, some of the masculinization of the external genitalia can result in fusion of the labia, for example. This can make it difficult to urinate naturally or can cause discomfort for an individual from birth. Later on, even if there are no issues to begin with, later on, as this person may want to explore their sexuality and be sexually active, that may be a different discussion. For eventual like safety and comfort. But there are immediate health concerns that sometimes do need to be addressed. In some cases, there are, organs that are maybe twisted or anatomy that is not fully formed. These are things that, in order to restore health and function to those systems, do need to be addressed immediately. So something like cloacal exstrophy, it affects the reproductive, urinary, and digestive organs, resulting in some inverted or incompletely formed structures. These are things that need to be addressed immediately so that those systems can function and the child can develop normally within the structure of their digestive and their reproductive systems. I would say that elective surgeries, even ones that are sometimes deemed preventative, fall into a patient autonomy perspective for me. So this is something like a um, a child born with external genitalia that appears to be more masculinized or more feminized than we would typically see for a male or a female child. So this will be maybe a clitoris that is deemed larger than typical on a female bodied child, or a penis that is deemed smaller than typical on a male bodied child. Um, those are primarily aesthetic surgeries, and there's no telling what that child will want or how they will identify later in their own life because they are an infant. And I like to assume best intentions that parents have when making these decisions, and even that medical staff have when they're making recommendations. But ultimately, when listening to folks from the intersex community, folks who received surgeries, they you know, later learned about and ultimately didn't want, or folks who did not receive surgery at all. The prevailing wisdom here from intersex advocates themselves is that, aesthetic and optional surgery should be left until the child can have informed consent and the child can help make those decisions about their own body. So I think it's important to listen to the people who have had this experience. And, you know, when we look at the psychological outcomes from intersex children, as adults, ones who did not have surgeries that they could not consent to had better psychological outcomes. They were more satisfied with their body, and physiologically, there was lower risk of infection and compromised sexual experience. So, because this is a very sensitive area of the body, and there are a lot of nerves that are really involved in the reproductive system, we do see complications that reduce people's ability to enjoy sexual intercourse later, but also have sensation and feeling in those areas. So, you know, working on an infant with infant-sized anatomy is a unique challenge, and really, we should try try not to do elective surgeries on infants when we can help it. There are obviously cases when it's medically necessary, but you know, listening to prevailing wisdom within the field, it's definitely a waiting game, and listening to the child when they come to a place where they can understand their body and their experience.
Yeah, of course. I totally agree. We should listen to intersex people, talk about their experiences, and use that to inform future policy. So it sounds like you're saying, if I can summarize, that for the medically necessary surgeries, or those that are deemed medically necessary as opposed to aesthetic, the medically necessary ones probably should continue with parents' consent, but the more aesthetic ones, to make people fit more into perception of what they should look like, should probably wait until the child is old enough to consent to that by themselves. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of a lot of the change in perspective needs to come from multiple angles, right? I think a lot of parents are really scared in a moment of understanding and learning, perhaps for the first time, what intersex is as a sex category, what their child's medical condition is, if they have a specific medical condition or health concern that is associated with one. So, a diagnosis period is very scary right after becoming a new parent, especially if it's your very first child. And you want to be able to trust your doctor, right? If you are not yourself within the medical field and you're not yourself knowing or understanding the terms that are being used or the diagnoses that are being thrown around, not a lot of people have medical literacy to the level that, you know, you might need to navigate this situation. So we want to hope that our medical professionals are being trained in a way that is sensitive to this issue, and that they are being held to a standard within their own community to do better by their intersex patients.
Hmm, makes sense. Right after a child's born, just show them this podcast. It'll solve everything. um,
I mean, one can only hope it's that easy, but we know it's not.
yeah. Yeah. So it brings
I
up
love the optimism.
exactly, exactly. It brings up an interesting question I have. A side question, I guess, is: do you believe, and do you know if the intersex community believes, we should call people intersex people, or people that are intersex, kind of like the movement that happened a while ago to say people that have autism rather than autistic people? Do you know if the intersex community, and do you have an opinion on this, wants to be called one way or the other, or are you not sure, or a different option?
I would say when using it as a sex classification, I think it's a fine thing to say intersex. In general, I've noticed we're moving in the general direction of a person-centered dialogue. So a person who is intersex, um, a patient who is intersex, someone who is intersex, centering their personhood beyond this part of their identity, as they're multifaceted, made up of many beautiful parts. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not specifically aware, and that's definitely something for me to investigate and grow from as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. Like you said, well, multifaceted. Um, I want to ask you one more question about intersex people, and then move back to sex and gender. We talked a bunch
Absolutely.
about intersex policy and intersex like policy in the hospital and how they operate on people. What legislation or policy changes would you support to further intersex rights? We talked a bit about surveys, having a sex option, male, female, other, or intersex, and having also gender be a free response category. In general, what kind of policy change would you support to further intersex rights?
Yeah, great question. I have noticed a lot lately on demographic forms that I am asked, to check a box for gender, and then they'll say male and female. And it's endlessly frustrating to me, as a scientist, who was trained very, very carefully to operationally define my variables and use precise language. It's very frustrating to me to see that colloquial switch or the colloquial just like assumption that they are the same. Um, to me, it speaks to where we're at in understanding differences of sex and gender, and the fact that many people don't understand these differences, and it's a difficult place to start, right? Some people think, this is not an important difference, and for people who live within their sex assigned birth matches directly to a gender um, label, and that is the extent of their interrogation of that experience. I think it's very difficult to take a step back and say, oh, I have work to do to learn, um, or how can I broaden my perspective or understanding. I think there's a lot of pushback, especially right now, and I would say in the last 10 years, behind needing to be specific about language, and the intent versus impact of offending someone by not being precise with your language, right? I didn't mean to make that mistake, therefore it doesn't matter that I made the mistake. It very much does. And it's okay to come from a place of ignorance and grow, right? Like if we have best intentions and we, can move forward from mistakes and learn from those, I think that is a wonderful opportunity to grow. Um, and I think a lot of the start is understanding why it's important that sex and gender are different and don't need to map one to one a specific, female to woman, male to man. They're not interchangeable. And I think that's very important to reiterate, unfortunately, again and again until it permeates more of our common spaces, job applications, driver's license application. Um, if we want to have biological sex on there, we got to use the right words. If we want to have gender on there, we got to use the right words. You'll see different states using different words. It doesn't make a ton of sense. And I was invited to explore kind of the psychology behind, when it doesn't make sense. Is it logical? Is it emotional? Is it careless? Where do we draw the boundaries around that imprecise language and, from a scientific perspective, inaccurate language? Back to your original question, legislative changes. Um, I would love to see legislation at the federal level, which I know is kind of a pipe dream at this particular moment with the federal government, but I would like to see federal protections for intersex folks, access to necessary health care and psychological support with informed consent. So, getting the health care that they need, but also allowing them the autonomy to make their medical decisions when they're able, and to not allow other people to make those decisions for them that are not medically necessary until they are able to interact with that decision themselves. This again is something that the Intersex Society of North America, which is the leading advocacy group in North America, really is pushing for. And I think, as the primary advocacy group made up of intersex folks, like, this is who we need to be listening to and to be, elevating their voices as they ask for this particular change.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds good. I sign off on that. um, well, you mentioned a pipe dream at the federal level. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the Trump administration defining female as, quote, a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces a large reproductive cell, and male as, quote, a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. I believe that language might have changed as well. There's a whole story about it. But curious on how your thoughts are on the Trump administration defining man and woman, or male and female. I forgot what terms they use.
Yes, they try to do it all. That is a document I have read all the way through several times. As we discussed when we defined intersex definitions, there are important differences between intersex and trans individuals. It just pertains to different aspects of someone's identity, right? Like cis and trans, intersex, male, female, these are addressing totally different things. But I think that this document's attempt is to diametrically separate gender, and to tie genders to sex categories. Um, and this like very dimorphic view of sex and gender originates in ignorance and has been like perpetuated in stigma and, honestly, hate. I don't find it to be scientifically accurate, in the most general sense. And then, setting aside my personal beliefs, about how we should make the world work, um, it's inaccurate. It leaves people out, right? Like, great. So XX individuals are female and they produce eggs. That is not true of all XX people. It is not true of all female people. And it's, you know, um, and it's definitely not true of all women. So I think there's just logical holes in this definition because it erases intersex people. So we can say kind of all we want about the motivations for this, but what are the practical implications for intersex folks? Um, Intersex individuals are born with biologically diverse internal and external reproductive organs. It simply occurs at a genetic difference that is a natural occurrence in nature. In many cases, they do not produce sex cells, so eggs or sperm, or if they do, they're not biologically able to reproduce due to other differences in their internal anatomical structures. So defining sex in this way is very exclusionary. Whether that's and generously an oversight, right? Like we don't know intersex people exist, so we are defining sex in this way, or a deliberate attempt to erase people who do not conform to two sex categories instead of three. Um, you know, either way, it's intent versus impact. Like either way, the impact is that um, intersex folks may struggle to receive the healthcare that they need. If there is a medical necessity associated with a particular um, genetic condition, right, that manifests as an intersex experience, healthcare may be required to make that person's life comfortable, to allow them to have a life, and to allow them to thrive. This is totally separate from gender confirming surgery, hormonal replacement that is more about gender identity. In some cases, intersex folks need hormone therapy to live, right? To live as a person, let alone as themselves. So I think this kind of ideology with the intention to strip one group of their rights and access is hurting another group as well. Um, and it's likely intentional, or even if it's not, it's still going to hurt a lot of people. Intersex folks make up about 2% of the population. I would say that's a conservative estimate based on how data is gathered, um, but they're here and we're deliberately deciding not to take care of them.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff, but I agree that it seems to be very hateful and hurtful and more ideologically driven than scientifically driven. Um,
Absolutely. I think, the imprecision of language is, like I said, at best, it's coming from a place of not knowing, of being unaware. Um, but the scientific community is, we're specifically trained to expand our view based on new evidence. This is not new evidence, but even if it's new to you, as you learn new things, we should be incorporating that into our understanding of how to move forward and how to better serve the public, especially as government elected officials whose whole job is to represent and to serve the people.
yeah, and these is the categories where definitions matter. Science and legal realm. Like, be as precise as possible. Don't just write something based on ideology or ChatGPT or just whatever you thought up on the fly.
And this is absolutely an intersection of science and legality, right? Science and legislation is it's very important to be, like you said, precise for creating legislation because that's how we use the law. It's how the law is interpreted. If you leave it open to interpretation, it does kind of leave these windows for creative license, which is not something that science sits super well with. Um, but I think there's, tremendous psychological strife, physical risk, and well documented negative outcomes for these early surgical interventions on intersex children. And the pressure to perform these surgeries, whether it's pressure that's put on doctors, pressure by doctors on parents, or pressure on these children, if they're making these decisions themselves later in life or conforming to decisions that were made for them. It's a likely result of this societal and legislative shift as we move in this direction of, a dimorphic conception of sex, a dimorphic conception of gender. Um, Both are harmful in similar ways, but they, may affect different populations. They may affect the same population. Thinking one way about intersex folks and one way about trans people, like they inform each other. So truly the goal to oppress trans folks is not limited to affecting or the desire to only affect one group. It's definitely something that spreads throughout if we're uncomfortable with this nuance, with trying to understand the nuance between sex and gender, it's definitely a mistake that will get made and a confluence of events that like leads to oppression and erasure of vulnerable groups of people, especially when we're talking about children.
Yeah, I agree. It's important to fight back. So we're almost out of time. I had a couple more questions to get to before we run out of time. Um, I want to leave folks with a viewpoint of sex that they can wrap their heads around if they come from a place of only knowing it as binary and have the perception of seeing all these new terms about sex and be confused. I want to leave them with the perception that they can probably wrap their heads around. I want to ask you, do you agree with the viewpoint that sex is a quote bimodal distribution where most attributes tend to cluster? For example, most men are taller than most women, but there are overlaps between the categories. Some women are taller than some men, and there are some individuals who don't fit neatly into either distribution. For example, a person with both breasts and facial hair. Do you agree with that viewpoint, or do you think it's a better viewpoint for sex?
I think the bimodal distribution is a really helpful conceptualization of lots of sex-based characteristics. So I think with most biological traits and phenotypes that differentiate the sexes, there's diversity in each category, and then there's overlap. So as you said, with height, many men are taller than many women, some women are taller than some men, etc. We get that with breast tissue size, and then also with like the penis to clitoris kind of continuum as well, right? Some clitorises clitori are larger than others, and some penises are larger than others. And there's some kind of like overlap in the middle. There's some ambiguity between the structures. These structures are all derived from the same structures in utero, right? Like you start with these same structures that differentiate. And so I think understanding developmental biology and understanding how fetal development, embryonic development happen and at which point differentiation occurs and how that happens, how many factors are involved, really gives you an appreciation of how lucky we are to exist, how hard it is. Like so many things have to go right to have a fetus, right? Occur at all. And then to make it to birth and to have a healthy birth, like so many things need to occur in that developmental trajectory. When we focus down on reproductive development alone, right? So many things need to occur in this developmental cascade. And diversity occurs when changes or deviations occur at different points along that trajectory. And there are still many ways to have a healthy child, right? And they think you get that bimodal appreciation when you see all of these factors come together. It's really the gift of science, the gift of understanding how these traits work, and we get that very, very clearly, in my opinion, with when we talk about sex, when we talk about male individuals and female individuals, population wise, 49% of the population male, 49% of the population female. Okay, 2%, that little overlap, intersex. And it makes sense to think about, everybody falls somewhere on this continuum. Many people fall in these kind of like two most popular areas, right? Most well distributed areas. But there are people on either end of the spectrum, and in the middle they meet. And that is a great way to conceptualize the diversity in sex.
Yeah, just don't have it be categories anymore. You know, like think about it as everything else. Like for example, like my eyes are blue. I categorize them as blue, but really they're blue gray, and they're different than other blues I've seen. I've seen other brighter blues, darker blues. It's all just a continuum. You know.
Yes. Fun fact about eye color, though. I most people are uh, when you do like Punnett squares and you talk about Mendelian genetics, most people are taught that eye color is one gene. It's actually so many genes.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was that was one of my like, oh, science fallacies that, is simplified to be taught about genetics, but is in fact a complex combination of multiple genes.
That makes sense. An example of things not just being black and white, simple. You know.
Yes, and just because we learned it in elementary school and it made sense then doesn't necessarily mean things haven't changed or we aren't capable of growing with the nuance.
That's true. That's true. Like I saw a post about basic physics is that there are three states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. But complex physics or advanced physics is there's also plasma. You know, basic biology might just be male and female. Advanced biology, male, female, intersex, all these categories, distributions. Um, yeah,
The joy of growth as we learn about ourselves and we learn about the world around us, I think, you know, being uncomfortable with realizing that you don't understand or realizing that there's more to learn is a super real, superhuman experience, right? That's how we grow. And it's deeply uncomfortable to be wrong. But if you can sit with that and you can hold that and make space for growing into something new, there's a real beautiful opportunity to appreciate so much beauty and diversity about our world and about our people in it.
that's so true. That's so true. Well, I want to end with one last question. This is a question that conservatives claim that those who believe in what we believe can't answer. But I want to prove that wrong. I want to prove that we can answer this question. What is a woman?
What is a woman? Who is a woman? Um, Anyone who self identifies as a woman is a woman. You don't have to be female. You don't have to behave a certain way. You don't have to dress a certain way or express your gender in a specific way. Like, it's a fill in the blank question.
I like that.
And I would challenge that as a non-answer, right? I think people will say like, "Oh, that's not an answer." I'm like, "It is. It's uncomfortable for you to sit with, but it's an answer." Um, and I think there's such beauty in the creativity that question generates.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good way to end it. Chloe, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.